And let's give an example of a food cost control system. Let's start off with a typical restaurant. Let's just say average restaurant, medium quality, doing about $20,000 a week turnover, and also with a food cost of say 30%, $6,000, a labor cost of 35%, $2,000 rent, 10%, which is a fixed cost, miscellaneous expenses, which are also fixed costs of $2,000 or 10%. So two variable costs there, obviously food cost and labor cost. That's typical of trading they have been doing for the last 3 6 months. That's been the trend. And turning over a nice profit around 15% of $3,000 a week. Now let's do weather weeks. And now let's do weather weeks. And turnover dropped to say $16,000 a week. They did manage to cut back their purchases, $500 a week, and had occasional staff there where they could reduce hours. They saved $500 a week. So the cost was down to $6. And dear $500 a week. Rent was still the same. And the expenses are due to the fixed costs. The restaurant only had basic training on portion control, had the real costs. And also this week, they employed a casual chef because the other chef was off sick or away. And they were a bit more generous with their servings because there was no standard recipes. And basically they had to throw away some of the perishables because they basically didn't have any clear purchasing process. They stuck to pretty much the same purchases as other weeks. And there was some wastage. Obviously the portion sizes were larger and you got back to these costs. So consequently, they made no profit. That's money. So they went from $3,000 a week profit to zilch, nil. They could have been worse. They could have gone to negative territory. But as you can see, if this trend continues, they're still going to pay rent, still pay expenses, and they've got to start cutting back their costs because it's eating into their profits and obviously savings as well too, and could put this restaurant into trouble. Although the reduction in sales was unavoidable, as I said before, it went down from $3,000 to nil. They managed to cut back on their losses and employed at least one of the systems, good portion control system, staff training to make sure their recipe cards were being followed. They purchased specifications. They watched their purchases. Things could have been a bit different. Let's see now this restaurant again with what happened. Food costs kept it to 30%. They reduced their purchases to $4,800. They managed to keep their labor costs at 35%. The casuals cut back on their hours for those bad weeks, kept at 35%. Obviously, there was nothing they could do about their rent. Their $2,000 rent and $2,000 miscellaneous expenses was down to 12.5%, which is still not fantastic. The bottom line is they still managed to make a decent 10% profit of $1,600. So they're in the black. They did make sure they worked to their standard recipes. They kept an eye on their labor cost. The actual casual chef knew what he or she was doing. They had standard recipes. They knew the portion sizes, cut back on extra generosity, which would have eaten into their food cost. And also, like I mentioned before, they did save on their buying. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, they can't do much about the rent miscellaneous expenses. But if you operate this sort of system throughout the whole restaurant, you employ the other items in the cost control system, you can see by a simple example like this, how it would keep your margins reasonable, even in bad situations where you can't help, whether it be bad weather, seasonal fluctuations. You've got distractions like elections and droughts and higher inflation and strikes and holiday periods. These things happen, but we've got to stay on top of these costs in order to make sure we keep our operation going. So this is a basic example. I would talk about more examples later on, but this shows some of the advantages of having a system in place, which unfortunately most restaurants don't have this situation in place or very little of it.